Because that number Drake hit this week was never the real story. The real story is that Aubrey Drake Graham crossed 100 million monthly listeners on Spotify. The celebration post went up, the victory lap started. And then the count almost immediately started sliding, while the same rollout that was supposed to prove total domination began exposing the exact opposite problem. Volume is not loyalty. Hype is not retention. And a machine can flood the zone way faster than it can make people come back. And if you think this is just about a number wobbling from 100 million down into the high 97 million range, you are already looking at the wrong screen. Because the monthly listener drop, the chart cooling, the old Kendrick lawsuit shadow still hanging over everything, and the resurfaced Rogét Chahayed story about getting no credit or publishing on Kendrick Lamar material are not random pieces of gossip. They all touch the same nerve. They all raise the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the public moment is gigantic, but the trust underneath it is shaky? What happens when an artist can still generate record-setting, first-week noise, but the deeper conversation is no longer about the music winning on its own? And most importantly, what happens when the audience starts separating spectacle from substance in real time? Drake did hit 100 million monthly listeners, and the source noted fans quickly noticed a dip back below that mark, while Spotify's own artist page now shows him under the milestone again. That alone would be a conversation. But once we get to the Spotify correction, the Billboard drop-offs, and the Roget contract angle, you are going to understand why this whole story is way bigger than did Drake have a good week or a bad week. And that is exactly why so many people are framing this wrong. The lazy version of this conversation is to say the Icebox King fell off. I do not think that is the cleanest read. The even lazier version is to say the giant numbers prove everything is fine and everybody else is hating. I do not think that is honest either. The real story sits in the tension between those two extremes. Drake can still move a disgusting amount of traffic. Nobody serious is denying that. Billboard and The Hollywood Reporter both documented that Iceman became Spotify's most streamed album in a single day in 2026, and that Drake became Spotify's most streamed artist in a single day in 2026 when he dropped Iceman alongside Habibti and Maid of Honour. That is not normal star power. That is industrial scale attention. But the fact that the rollout was massive is not the same thing as the public being deeply connected to the material after the first shockwave. And once you realize that, the mood changes. Because now we are not asking whether Complaint Boy can still open big. Of course he can. We are asking whether the machine is still converting attention into belief, whether the songs are sticking beyond the launch event, and whether the culture is still willing to treat every giant Drake number like proof of invincibility. When we get to the business side of this, especially that Rogét Chahayed story and the broader issue of how people confuse placement, publishing, leverage, and actual ownership, it gets even messier. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. So let's slow this down and set the table the right way, because this is one of those stories where the timeline matters just as much as the headline. Drake spent months teasing Iceman, turning the rollout into an event, then detonated the whole thing by not only releasing Iceman on May 15th, but pairing it with two more albums, Habibti and Maid of Honour. That move alone guaranteed attention, because now the conversation was no longer just is the album good. It was, how do we even process 43 new Drake records at once? The opening blast absolutely worked. NPR reported that the three projects debuted at numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the Billboard 200, while Iceman alone opened with 463,000 equivalent units. Billboard later reported Iceman stayed at number 1 for a fourth week with 133,000 equivalent units, most of that from streaming. So no, this is not some fantasy world where Drake suddenly became irrelevant overnight. He is still one of the biggest acts on the planet. That is exactly why this matters. When somebody that big starts showing cracks in the conversion from spectacle to staying power, the cracks tell you more than the raw peak ever could. And culturally, this is landing in a very different atmosphere than the old automatic Drake win era. The Kendrick Lamar battle did not just give people diss records. It changed the emotional temperature around Drake. A lot of people who used to treat him like the untouchable center of rap now treat him like a figure who has to defend his legitimacy every time he makes a giant move. That shift matters because gigantic debuts used to settle the argument in his favor. Now they just start a new argument. Some people see the chart sweep and say, there, he still runs everything. Other people see the same chart sweep and say, okay, but what happens after the opening flood? That difference in interpretation is the whole game. The public is no longer consuming Drake inside one stable story. He is being read through multiple narratives at once. Superstar, survivor, overextended hit chaser, lawsuit rapper, still dangerous pop strategist, maybe all at the same time. And whenever an artist reaches that point, every metric becomes more symbolic than usual. A rise is not just a rise. A dip is not just a dip. It becomes evidence in a larger identity war. Financially, musically, reputationally. This week carries a lot more weight than casual fans want to admit. If the numbers stay huge and the songs stabilize, Drake gets to say the machine still works and the audience still follows wherever he goes. If the numbers cool quickly and the conversation keeps drifting away from the music itself, then the giant opening starts looking less like a coronation and more like a stress test. And once a release turns into a stress test, people stop asking whether it debuted big and start asking whether it actually deepened the artist's hold on the culture. That is why the monthly listener slide matters. That is why the chart movement matters. That is why the revived Roget story matters. One is a public metric, one is a market metric, and one is a business morality lesson. All three are telling us to stop staring at the fireworks and start studying what survives the smoke. So the question for this whole video is simple. Did this rollout prove Drake is still too big to fail, or did it accidentally prove that even a giant can no longer force the culture to feel more than it actually feels? Start with the cleanest, most visible receipt. Drake reached 100 million monthly listeners on Spotify, which the source framed as a landmark achievement. But the same piece also acknowledged that fans noticed the number slip back below the line almost immediately. And right now, Spotify's public artist page shows Drake at 97,753,175 monthly listeners. That is still monstrous. Let me be clear. I am not doing fake outrage over somebody only being in the high 97 millions. That would be clown behavior. But does everybody understand what the symbolism is here? The headline was 100 million. The follow-up was actually not for long. That matters because the public flex lasted longer than the milestone itself. And when the flex outlives the number, the conversation changes from dominance to volatility. Even more important, Spotify for Artists explains that monthly listeners are unique listeners over the last 28 days, active and programmed. In other words, this is a rolling window stat. So yes, dips are natural. But that does not rescue the spin. It actually sharpens the point. A rolling metric is supposed to reflect sustained recent reach, and if it starts slipping right after the celebration, that tells you the spike was powerful but fragile. Now move to the second visible receipt, which is where Complaint Boy's defenders start getting nervous. Billboard reported that Janice STFU spent a second week at #1 on the Hot 100, but look at the texture of that win. The song's official US streams were down 22% week over week, while radio impressions were up 240%. That is a very different story than a song exploding, because the public keeps organically pressing play harder every day. And Billboard also showed the shape of the top 10 tightening fast. Shabang held at #4, ran to Atlanta, dipped from #2 to #6, and Whisper My Name fell from #3 to #9. 1 week after Drake had debuted 9 new top 10 records. Can we have the real conversation now? When you flood the zone with 43 tracks, and then watch the top 10 footprint shrink that fast, the first interpretation is obvious. The opening week was huge. But the second interpretation is the one that decides legacy. Which songs are actually building independent life after the intake blast? The stands here, #1, and stop reading. I hear streams down 22%, radio doing more of the lifting, and top 10 count already thinning. And I hear a project moving from event mode into retention mode. That is where the truth always lives. And before anybody jumps in acting like this is some anti-Drake fiction, let's add context that actually helps him. Billboard later reported Iceman remained #1 on the Billboard 200 for a fourth week with 133,000 equivalent units, including 135.82 million on-demand streams in that week alone. Again, that is not collapse. That is still major force. But a huge album can still have a more complicated narrative at the song level. An album can be commercially dominant, while its early aura of invincibility quietly cools off. That is what makes this conversation interesting. It is not Drake is done. It is Drake is still enormous, but the quality of the momentum is changing. There's a difference between a monster release that keeps deepening its grip and a monster release that begins settling toward its real floor once curiosity, discourse, and first-wave shock burn off. If you cannot tell those apart, you are not reading the market. You are just cheering at the scoreboard. Third receipt. The launch itself had a weird little stain on it that people tried to brush past way too fast. Billboard updated its original story to note that Spotify said Make Them Cry did not actually set the single-day song record because the initial review process had been completed manually and streams from 2 different album tracks were combined. Read that again. The platform itself had to say, in effect, "Our bad, we merged 2 tracks." Now I want to be clear, because this is where people get goofy and start freelancing accusations. That is not proof Drake did anything wrong. That is not proof of some criminal plot. But it is absolutely proof that the optics of this rollout were sloppy enough to trigger correction-level confusion on day one. And when you're already dealing with a public climate where people are hyper-skeptical about how narratives get manufactured around major releases, that kind of correction is gasoline. The machine needed clean triumph. What it got was triumph with an asterisk. And once people smell an asterisk, they start asking what else they are supposed to look at more carefully. 4th receipt. Shabang is probably the strongest example of why this is not a simple doom story. Complex reported that the song sparked a viral social media challenge, with thousands of users making drinks, food, and objects appear via edits, timed to the Money on the Beat, Shabang line. Drake himself joined the trend in a Turks and Caicos clip, and Complex noted the track was sitting inside the Hot 100 Top 10, while celebrities like Summer Walker and Stunna Sandy also amplified the challenge. So yes, the Icebox King still knows how to create a memeable, sticky, platform-friendly record. Nobody honest can deny that. But here is where the sarcasm has to give way to investigation. Viral utility is not the same thing as emotional devotion. TikTokable does not automatically mean timeless. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it absolutely does not. And if one of your clearest cultural wins is a trend record while the rest of the conversation keeps circling back to numbers, lawsuits, and rollout theatrics, that tells me the audience is still willing to play with the product without fully surrendering to the mythology around it. That distinction is everything. And I think we need to set the record straight on what is actually happening here. People keep arguing as if one side has to be fully true. Either Drake is unstoppable and all criticism is hate, or he is finished and every success is fake. I am sorry, but that is baby brain discourse. The mature read is harder and way more interesting. Drake can still generate absurd opening force. He can still dominate headlines. He can still produce a song that grabs the apps. But the public reaction after the first blast is no longer automatic, no longer reverent, and no longer emotionally unified. That is why the listener drop lands harder than it would have landed 3 or 4 years ago. It is not because 97 million is small. It is because the culture has stopped treating every giant Drake stat like a final verdict. And once that stops, every subsequent decline, correction, or cool-off starts carrying meaning it never used to carry. And oh, do I have more for you? Because the stands are really not going to like this next part. Up to now, we have just been dealing with the front-facing stuff. Listener counts, chart movement, stream corrections, viral clips. That is the easy layer. The part coming next is where the atmosphere changes. Because now we have to talk about what the people around the culture are actually revealing with their reactions. Not the sanitized press release version. Not the victory lap montage. The deeper mood. The industry memory. The part where a revived Rogét Chahayed clip turns into a whole argument about credits, contracts, publishing, and who really gets fed when huge cultural moments happen. And once we line that up next to Drake's own recent legal history, the entire story stops looking like random chaos and starts looking like a culture that is deeply suspicious of how power is being used behind the curtain. One of the biggest cultural tells here is that the public still reads Drake through the Kendrick Lamar battle, whether his team likes it or not. That shadow has not gone anywhere. The Hollywood Reporter and Billboard both covered the dismissal of Drake's defamation suit against UMG over Kendrick's Not Like Us, with Judge Jeanette Vargas ruling that a reasonable listener would not conclude the song conveyed objective facts, and that diss tracks are full of hyperbole, profanity, trash talk, and figurative language. Billboard quoted the judge calling Drake's republication argument logically incoherent. Think about how devastating that is culturally, not just legally. For months, one of the biggest artists in the world tried to shift part of the battle into a courtroom framework, and the court essentially said the context of rap battle rhetoric matters too much for the claim to stand the way he wanted. So now every new Drake moment gets interpreted through that scar tissue. Every boast sits next to that loss. Every giant number sits next to the fact that the culture still remembers that the lawsuit move got mocked, debated, and then thrown out. The right song can still go number one. The stigma does not vanish with it. That matters because hip-hop is not just a sales business. It is a symbolic authority business. The same public that will stream you all day can still downgrade your aura if they think you moved wrong in the biggest moment. And that is where Kendrick has become the silent hero in this whole thing, without even needing to be in the room. That does not need to respond every week. He does not need to pop up and narrate every shift. The effect of what already happened is doing the work for him. Not like us, won Grammys, lived in massive public spaces, and remained culturally quoted long after the battle. So when Drake has a giant launch and then a fast-moving, okay, but let's see if it sticks conversation follows, that is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in a post-battle environment where the audience learned to question him more aggressively than before. One person has to constantly prove that the engine is still roaring. The other has people measuring the engine without him even speaking. One person is chasing the mood. The other changed it. Then there is the Rogét Chahayed angle, which is where a lot of people online started yelling, TD scammed him, with absolutely zero patience for nuance. Here is the part one need everybody to hear clearly. What recently resurfaced is not some brand new expose that fell out of the sky yesterday. It is a long-standing story Rogét Chahayed himself has discussed publicly in interviews. The Los Angeles Times reported in 2021 that Chahayed and Wesley Singerman made beats in 2013, sold them in a cash transaction, and later heard those compositions on Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly in 2015, specifically On You, and For Sale? Interlude. The Times said that because of the contract they had signed, they could not claim credit or royalties. Music Business Worldwide later quoted Chahayed explaining that the contract said no royalties, and that he and his collaborator did not think much of it at the time because they were treating it like a passion project. That is not a small detail. That is the entire spine of the story. Now, could you fairly say that the situation sounds brutal? Absolutely. Chahayed himself described feeling angry and in a rage when he realized what had happened. Could you fairly say people in that chain handled business in a way that benefited themselves more than the younger creators who lacked leverage? Sure, that is how the industry often works, and it is exactly why these stories keep stinging. But if you're going to tell the story honestly, you cannot flatten it into Kendrick stole beats or TD committed some cartoon robbery without the contract context. Chahayed also said in the Times piece that artists are often unaware of how the business is being handled behind the scenes. That matters. And Jbutha's old TPAB credits breakdown even lists Rogét Chahayed with Rhodes and Keys, On You, and For Sale? Interlude, which complicates the simplistic internet version even more. So the cultural reaction here tells us something interesting. People are less interested in the precise legal architecture than they are in what the story symbolizes. And what it symbolizes, to a lot of producers and fans, is that if you do not understand your paperwork, the biggest look of your life can still leave you on the outside of your own success. Listen, I just have to say this. This is why the recent attempt to weaponize that Rogét story as some instant anti-Kendrick nuke felt so desperate to me. Because the deeper you read, the less it looks like a sudden moral collapse of Kendrick Lamar, and the more it looks like an old, ugly lesson about how music business leverage works on young creators. That is not me excusing anything ugly about the process. That is me refusing to let the spin room flatten a business lesson into Stan War confetti. If you want to be serious about credits and ownership, then be serious. Talk about work-for-hire structures. Talk about selling out rights for upfront cash. Talk about how young producers chase placement before they understand participation. Talk about how a classic album can contain stories of brilliance and exploitation at the same time. But do not run into the timeline screaming gotcha, like you just discovered fire. The real issue is bigger, sadder, and far more common than a Stan account wants to admit. And that cultural response also tells you why Drake's monthly listener slide feels louder than it mathematically is. The audience is already primed to read every Drake wobble as evidence of a larger instability. Meanwhile, the audience is also primed to read every Kendrick-adjacent controversy through the lens of okay, but what is the actual paperwork and chain of responsibility here? That is not because one side has perfect saints and the other side has perfect villains. It is because one artist is currently associated with discipline, aftermath victory, and not needing to oversell himself every week, while the other is associated with force, spectacle, and a constant need to prove the room still belongs to him. That is a brutal cultural difference. One person's silence feels like confidence. The other person's noise increasingly feels like maintenance. But now I need to hit the brakes and change gears completely, Because if we stay at the level of fan reactions and headlines, we are going to miss the part that actually matters most. This is where basic commentary channels tap out. This is where I have to be the annoying friend who drags the party into the paperwork drawer. Because the real story here is not just about Drake losing a couple million monthly listeners from a milestone peak. And it is not just about an old Rogét Chahayed story going viral again. The real story is about three different systems colliding at once: streaming optics, chart architecture, and contract leverage. And when those three collide, a lot of myths die fast. First, systemic angle. Streaming optics are built for spectacle, not nuance. Spotify monthly listeners sound like a loyalty score to casual fans. But Spotify's own support pages make clear the stat is simply unique listeners in the last 28 days, including both active and programmed listeners. That means the number is extremely useful for scale and reach, but much less useful as a one-line referendum on how deeply those people are bonded to the music. A monster release can juice that number quickly because curiosity counts. Playlist exposure counts. Casual sampling counts. But what the metric cannot tell you by itself is how many of those people became intentional repeat listeners after the event. Spotify even separates monthly active listeners from the larger monthly listener pool because intentional repeat behavior matters differently. So when Drake hits 100 million and then slides back below it, I do not read that as washed. I read it as a perfect lesson in why fan bases misuse headline metrics. The number proves incredible reach. The fast pullback raises questions about how much of that reach was durable attachment versus launch window gravity. Those are not the same thing. Second, systemic angle. Chart architecture rewards flooding the market in ways older eras simply did not. NPR made this point directly when it discussed Drake's 3-album sweep and 40-song Hot 100 burst, noting that streaming-era chart records need context because the commercial landscape now allows artists to drop enormous volumes of songs at once and have all of them chart. That does not make the achievements fake. It makes them structurally different. If you release 43 songs in one blast, you are not just betting on quality. You are betting on sheer surface area. You are giving the market more hooks, more playlist placements, more algorithmic touchpoints, more chances for 1 or 2 records to pop while the rest pad your total footprint. Again, that is not cheating. It is strategy. But when fans then turn around and act like the totality of those chart explosions means every record has equal cultural force, they are lying to themselves. One person takes 10 swings and lands 2 cleanly. Another person takes 43 swings and lands 4. The headline might praise the total hits. The deeper analysis asks about conversion rate, retention, and which swings people still remember a month later. And this is where the pattern interrupt really bites. We spend all day online arguing about who won as if victory is only a matter of chart screenshots. But labels, DSPs, and management teams are often playing an entirely different game. They care about market occupation, press cycle dominance, and audience capture across multiple surfaces at once. A triple release does not just aim for music consumption. It aims to occupy oxygen. It aims to make you feel like the artist is everywhere, which can itself become part of the commercial product. That is why the first week narrative matters so much. If the perception of inevitability gets built fast enough, a lot of people will keep repeating it even after the actual numbers start normalizing. That is why I said at the top that a machine can manufacture the moment much faster than it can manufacture return visits. The moment is created by occupation. The return visit is created by attachment. Those are totally different muscles. Third, systemic angle. The Rogét Chahayed story is really a contract literacy story disguised as celebrity drama. Music Business Worldwide quoted him saying the contract explicitly said no royalties, and the Los Angeles Times said he and Wesley Singerman could not claim credit or royalties because of what they had signed. That is the grim little engine underneath so many of these internet arguments. Young creators often mistake access for leverage. They think, I got the placement, I got in the room, I got paid something, this must be the win. Then the album becomes a classic, the system moves on, and they realize they touched history without owning a meaningful slice of it. That is not unique to TD. That is not unique to Kendrick. That is Music Business 101. And it is precisely why experienced producers obsess over splits, publishing, admin, credit language, and who is really authorized to shop a beat. People online scream scam because it gives them a villain they can point at. The more accurate word a lot of the time is asymmetric leverage. And asymmetric leverage is much harder to turn into a meme Because then you have to admit the system itself is built to reward whoever understands the paperwork best. What I think is happening here is that these three systems are colliding in one ugly public mirror. Drake's rollout shows how enormous reach can create spectacular but unstable optics. The chart records show how volume can create historic-looking scoreboards that still require context. The Roget story shows how getting on a legendary project can still leave a creator undercompensated or structurally disempowered if the paperwork is bad. So what is the common truth? Easy. In this business, scale and ownership are not the same thing. Visibility and leverage are not the same thing. And noise and control are definitely not the same thing. Drake can own the timeline and still not fully own the culture's trust. A young producer can touch a masterpiece and still not own the value he helped create. Does everybody understand how crazy that is? The same industry that can make you look enormous in public can leave you much smaller in the places that actually decide power. And once you understand that, the whole listener drop argument becomes a lot less childish and a lot more revealing. The reason people keep obsessing over those couple million listeners is not because they think 97 million is bad. It is because they sense, maybe even subconsciously, that the grand narrative machine is not landing with the same authority it used to. They feel the gap between the marketed meaning of a number and the lived meaning of the music. They feel the difference between everybody showed up to inspect the event and everybody decided to live inside the album. The spin room will tell you those are the same thing. They are not. And when the audience starts learning that distinction, the old tricks get less magical. Here is the major truth bomb, and this is the part a lot of people are going to hate because it does not flatter anybody's easy tribe. Drake's recent run did not primarily prove invincibility. It proved dependence. Dependence on scale. Dependence on occupation. Dependence on giant opening waves, massive release framing, and narrative over pressure. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting under all of this. Because at the center of the story were simply the music hit so hard people could not stop returning to it, we would not be spending this much time discussing the listener dip, the chart cooling, the stream correction, the legal aftertaste of the Kendrick battle, and a revived producer contract story in the same breath. The reason all these topics keep fusing together is that people can feel the machine straining. They can feel how much scaffolding has to stand around the music now. And let me make that even sharper. Dependence does not mean weakness in the cartoon sense. It means the strategy is doing more visible labor than before. It means the artist can still score huge, but the infrastructure of the score is harder to ignore. Iceman plus 2 companion albums was not just a musical statement. It was a market seizure tactic. The 100 million monthly listener celebration was not just a data point. It was a symbolic weapon. The virality of Shabang was not just a song living naturally. It was also an app-friendly conversion point. None of that is accidental. But the more obvious the architecture becomes, the more people start asking whether the architecture is carrying too much of the emotional burden. That is why the fast slide after the 100 million screenshot feels so loud. It is like catching the set crew moving scenery between scenes. The show is still huge, but suddenly you see the stagehands. And now look at the Rogét Chahayed story through that same lens. The truth bomb there is not, aha, Kendrick bad. The truth bomb is that the music business is absolutely full of situations where the people closest to the raw creative act do not control the value that comes later. Chahayed's own public comments make that brutally plain. He and Wesley Singerman made work that ended up associated with one of the most celebrated rap albums of its era. Yet, because of the contract structure, the classic status glow did not automatically become ownership glow. That is the same larger lesson in a different costume. Huge visibility does not guarantee power. Big moments do not guarantee leverage. Culture will celebrate the masterpiece, while the paperwork quietly sorts out who actually eats. And once you realize that, you stop being shocked that so many people in this ecosystem are obsessed with optics. Optics are what most people see. Ownership is what the real players protect. So the final brutal claim is this. What we are watching is not simply a battle between two rappers or two fan bases. We are watching the collapse of the old illusion that sheer scale settles all arguments. It does not. Not anymore. Scale can announce you. Scale can overwhelm the feed. Scale can buy time. But scale cannot force the culture to feel conviction it no longer naturally feels. And scale definitely cannot erase the difference between making people look and making people believe. That is why this week feels so loaded. Drake's numbers are still gigantic, yet the conversation around them sounds defensive. The Roget story resurfaces, yet the real lesson points past stan warfare and towards systemic leverage. The charts are impressive, yet even the impressive parts come with caveats, context, and cooling signs. That is not a clean victory narrative. That is a reckoning narrative. And the reason the right person still looks strongest after all of this is because Kendrick Lamar's side of a story has required less maintenance. That is the hero resolution. Dot's biggest advantage right now is not just that he won a public battle in the eyes of a lot of listeners. It is that his position feels low maintenance and disciplined. He is not the one having every number dissected for proof of invulnerability. He is not the one carrying the stigma of a dismissed lawsuit over a diss record. He is not the one needing 3 simultaneous albums to make the room feel crowded enough to equal destiny. One person is still benefiting from the afterglow of strategic precision. The other is trying to convert mass occupation into restored certainty. Those are not equal positions. Think about the contrast here. One person makes moves that force everybody to stop and reevaluate the hierarchy. The other makes moves that force everybody to ask how much fuel it took to make the hierarchy still look intact. One person's silence reads like command. The other person's noise reads like maintenance. That one line right there is the entire story. And before the stands start crying, no, that does not mean Drake cannot still win songs, moments, charts, or headlines. Of course he can. What it means is that the terms of victory have changed. Raw size no longer guarantees cultural closure. In fact, sometimes raw size invites more scrutiny than ever. I have been saying for a minute that the post-battle era was going to be about interpretation, not just output. And that is exactly where we are now. The audience is no longer passively receiving the biggest narrative. They are cross-examining it. They are looking at whether the songs hold, whether the follow-up behavior feels secure, whether the numbers have the same texture as the old days, whether the business stories surfacing around everybody involved tell us something uglier about the system. That is actually healthy for the culture. Messy, yes. Annoying, absolutely. But healthy. Because hip-hop should not be a place where every giant metric ends discussion. It should be a place where giant metrics start better questions. And I also want to give Rogét Chahayed his proper respect in this resolution. Because another lazy thing people do is turn stories like is into stan ammo and forget the creator in the middle. This is a producer billboard described as one of hip-hop and pop's most dependable hit machines, a classically trained pianist whose credits include Broccoli, Sicko Mode, Laugh Now, Cry Later, and Kiss Me More. The deeper lesson from his story is not victimhood as identity. It is survival through literacy, management, and persistence. Chahayed himself said the best move was to keep working after that setback. That is discipline. That is what long-game integrity looks like in a cutthroat business. So even inside the ugliness, the heroic thread is the same. The people who keep their craft sharp and learn the system eventually build something sturdier than the people who rely on momentary optics alone. So yes, controlled optimism is the right landing here. The culture is fine. The truth is actually doing what truth does. It is sorting things out over time. The giant can still be giant without being beyond criticism. The classic can still be classic while the business behind it gets examined. The fans can still enjoy records without pretending every spike is sacred. And the right people still tend to win in the long run. The disciplined artist, the informed creator, the listener who learns to separate real connection from raw noise. This is only the start, and not in the lazy YouTube way where somebody just promises more chaos because they need you to click again. I mean specifically. First, we need to watch whether Drake's current Spotify number stabilizes, rebounds, or keeps normalizing as that 28-day release window rolls forward. That will tell us whether the audience is converting from curiosity to actual repeat behavior. Second, we need to watch the next few chart turns for Janice, STFU, Shabang, and the rest of the Iceman cluster, because that will show us which records are becoming self-sustaining and which ones were launch week passengers. Third, and maybe most important, we need to keep tracking how often stories like Rogét Chahayed's keep resurfacing across the producer economy, because those stories are not side drama. They are the blood test for how this business really treats the people building the sound. So if you made it all the way here, you already know this was never just a Drake Lost Listeners video. This was a video about what those lost listeners symbolize, what those charts actually mean, and why the producer credit conversation is always bigger than the stan war trying to hijack it. Stay locked in, because the next phase of this story is where the easy narratives start breaking for real. And if you want the next video, I'm telling you right now, it might be even crazier. The song that looked like Drake's safest hit may actually be the clearest proof that the audience is splitting the man from a machine. And once we map that against the post-Kendrick power shift and the business incentives around flood the market releases, you are going to see why the next chapter is not about who screamed louder. It is about who the culture still trusts when the lights come back on.